It's a delight to be here, it really is. It's been a while since I've been able to be at the Chicago Humanities Festival. It's always a great treat for any of us who do this kind of thing to be invited. I especially want to thank Roger and Julie for being so instrumental in bringing me here. And it's a beautiful Sunday, so I'm really flattered and honored to see so many of you here today to listen to a talk about American history. Now, I know it's, the weekend before a rather large election, and perhaps some of what I have to say today will be pertinent to that. We're living in abnormal times, I think, in terms of American politics at the moment. Historians don't have as much to say about this particular election because it's so unlike any previous election. And one of the reasons, in fact, has to do with, I think, the state of our political parties in 2016 as opposed to what it's been in the past, and even the recent past. But I'll be reflecting on the past for the most part. I'll be doing some reading from the book, which came out last spring, which did have, I was thinking a little bit about what was to come, but it's mostly about the past. I'll be doing some reading, but I want to try to give you the main themes of what the book is about, the main themes the book is about. And they concern two things: the importance of politicians and egalitarians in the history of American politics. That there is a hidden history that most of us don't really understand or don't really recognize right away, and it has to do with the roles of the politicians and the egalitarians. And the most important part of the title of this book, which I will hold up, is the ampersand between politicians and egalitarians. These are two distinct, I think, but overlapping groups in American history that are the driving forces in American politics. But they're not always seen as groups that work together. They're seen as groups that are in opposition. They are seen as groups which are morally as well as politically distinct. Americans tend to see politicians as corrupt. I mean, let's face it. To Americans, and this is by no means a factor it's something unique to our own times, when the word politics appears, very often the word dirty kind of hovers about it, because politics is, by its very nature, involves compromise, corruption, money, deals, all the rest of it. We tend to see politicians as inherently corrupt. On the other hand, we tend to see egalitarians as pure. They are the people who, or at least purer than the politicians. These are the people who stand up for what is best in our political life and our political testament. These are those who speak truth to power. These are people who make the powerful uncomfortable. They are the ones who talk about the corruption of the politicians. And supposedly, at least this is my impression, or it was when I began this book, most of us think that change happens in American politics when the egalitarians somehow push the politicians to make change happen, to make the stasis that existed, the status quo, impossible to uphold. Supposedly, then, American political change occurs from the bottom up. Strictly from the bottom up. The politicians have to be shaken or they have to be divided, and then when that happens, things can really change. Does that sound familiar? Oh, good. Okay. Well, I get it, and there's some truth to that, but it's a partial truth. Because I think that way of looking at the past not only doesn't really completely explain the past historically, but I think it misses a moral as well as a political truth. And that moral truth was actually very well explained, and here I'll do a little bit of reading, by the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who spent some time here in Chicago when he wrote this, but ended up at the Union Theological Seminary in New York. He's a very important theologian of the 1950s. And Niebuhr wrote in 1929 in a very early bit of writing, quote, "It may be well for the statesman to know that statesmanship easily degenerates into opportunism, and that opportunism cannot be sharply distinguished from dishonesty. But the prophet ought to realize that his higher perspective and the uncompromising nature of his judgments always has a note of irresponsibility in it. Francis of Assisi may have been a better Christian than Pope Innocent III, but it may be questioned whether his moral superiority over the latter was as absolute as it seemed. Nor is there any reason to believe that Abraham Lincoln, the statesman and opportunist, was morally inferior to William Lloyd Garrison, the prophet. The moral achievement of the statesman must be judged in terms which take account of the limitations of human society, which the statesman must, and the prophet need not, consider. That's really my point. If we go at this simply seeing politics as an opposition between the pure and the corrupt, we miss the fact that the corrupt are the people who have to deal in the real world, and the real world is corrupt. And it's very difficult to get things done in a corrupt world if you're simply pure. That in fact, the realms of the politicians and the egalitarians are not distinct, or they are, but nothing gets done as long as they remain distinct from each other. And it's not a matter simply of the egalitarians pushing the politicians, because politicians aren't very easily pushed, let's face it. What happens is, I think, that from time to time there are convergences. There are times when the politicians and the egalitarians converge. Now, they converge for very complicated reasons. It's not a simple explanation. That's what keeps people like me in business. We will tell you just how complicated it always is, and talk about it at length. But the pattern, I believe, is one of convergence rather than of friction. The friction is there, but unless there is convergence, unless there is cooperation between the politicians and the egalitarians, nothing gets done. But when there is convergence, extraordinary things get done. Truly extraordinary things get done. Let me say just quickly in passing, these two groups are not completely mutually exclusive. There are plenty of politicians who have egalitarian ideals. There are plenty of egalitarians who are very, very skillful politicians. I think of the latter, the more I've studied the civil rights movement, the more I'm impressed with Martin Luther King's political skills, not just his prophetic grandeur, but his political skills and how he managed to get done what he managed to get done. And one can find any number of egalitarians among the politicians. So it's not as if we're talking about two completely different groups. Nevertheless, there is this convergence, I think, from time to time. Okay. That's the background. In making the case that I do about the hidden history of American politics, I say that there are two real keys to understanding American politics. Not these two groups, but two keys to understanding why American political history has proceeded as it has. The first key is the existence and the inevitability of political parties. Now, again, this is something that we don't necessarily kindle to. We've come to think of partisanship as a bad thing, especially in these days of a kind of abnormal hyper-partisanship. We tend to forget, although there are enough of us here who are my age, who can still remember when there was something like normal party politics. So it's become abnormal. That's something we might want to talk about afterwards. But when party politics, it has been the norm in American politics. Indeed, every time an attempt is made to come up with what we call it, nonpartisan or post-partisan or what have you, anti-partisan politics, they never work. They always fail. Parties have been the main vehicles for egalitarianism in American politics, believe it or not. It's not to say that they are always egalitarian, but they originated much against, I should add, much against the original ideas of the founders, the framers of the Constitution, who thought that parties were a bad thing. This country was founded on the proposition that parties were bad things. And within about 3 or 4 years, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and the rest of them discovered, well, wait a minute, we need political parties if we're going to handle a society that is as conflicted and is as diverse as this country is. There can be no grand consensus. There can be no post or pre or non-partisan politics. We are going to disagree. But the surest vehicle to conduct those disagreements and to fight it out are political parties. Particularly political parties as they grew in the 1790s and the early parts of the Republic, which were part of the process of democratization, the uneven, the tortuous process of democratization, which took really until the 1960s to complete, or to begin to complete. Nevertheless, parties became the major vehicle for that. And that's one key to American political history, is the presence and the inevitability, and I think actually the effectiveness of political parties. The second key to American political history, I think, is that from almost the very start, Americans have argued over inequality. That inequality, arguments about inequality, and economic inequality, other forms of inequality as well, but they tend to lap one over the other. Racial inequality, economic inequality, gender inequality, they are the key force, the really driving force for which the parties become the main vehicle. That going back to the very beginning of the Republic in the 1790s, Americans differed sharply over how great a distance there could be between the wealthiest and the poorest, the most privileged and the least privileged. There were plenty of Americans who thought that wasn't so much of a problem, that in fact the country could only grow by exacerbating inequalities. And then there were those who said, no, there has to be some cap on that. There has to be some way to arrest those inequalities, or else they will threaten first the Republic and then threaten American democracy. So, I posit that the two keys to American history, you can understand American political history as the history of these arguments over equality and inequality as fought through the political parties. And that you can see major moments in American political history, and then the familiar moments. 1800, 1828 to an extent, certainly 1860. I don't have to remind an Illinois crowd about that election. 1932, 1964. These are major elections and 1980 in a different way. These were major key elections, not just for the presidency, but that turned the character of American politics around. They were based in this question of inequality and parties playing them out. Okay, so that's the basic argument of the book. And I spend the first 2 chapters of the book explaining all of that in more laboriously than I just explained it now, but I hope wittily and with a certain amount of uplift. But then the book goes into very specific examples of political leaders, of political movements, of political moments like the Homestead Strike in Pennsylvania in the 1890s, in which you can see this convergence and this battle over inequality and political parties working themselves out in different ways. So that's really the heart of the book, is going back from the very beginning, really up to Lyndon Johnson, although sort of carrying over to Barack Obama as well. Beginning with Thomas Paine, whom I argue is the originator of American egalitarianism in many ways, going through Thomas Jefferson, on through people like John Brown, the egalitarianist terrorist, not a man who liked political parties very much, on through Teddy Roosevelt and on through the 30s, and then finally to the Great Society and Johnson, with some references to everything that's happened since the 1960s. So what I thought I'd do today is to present 2 of those figures to you. If I have time, I'll get to all 2. If not, I'll do one and have to shorten the other. And the 2 I chose are kind of naturals. I mean, anybody who studies American history is going to want to think about these people, but they're also 2 figures whose reputations of late have come under a certain degree of stress, shall we say. And those 2 figures are Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. And I want to talk about the 2 of them as politicians, supreme politicians in many ways. Abraham Lincoln, I think, the greatest political animal in American history, and how they were wrapped up in, enveloped in, entwined with the egalitarian tradition and how the politics of their times worked themselves out in that way. Okay? So that's what I'm going to try to do for the remainder of my time with you. And then we'll take questions and we can argue about it, and it's going to be a lot of fun. I hope. It'll be fun. Let's start with Thomas Jefferson. Now, most of us, again, looking at the crowd, most of us grew up thinking that Thomas Jefferson was a great man, right? A great Democrat. Well, his reputation has certainly taken a great tumble in the last 20 to 30 years. He's still seen by a lot of people, millions in fact, as a noble figure, right? The author of the Declaration of Independence. And with it, the formulation of the summation of the American egalitarian creed, although it's had to be expanded, that all men are created equal. We hold these rights to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Okay. The Jefferson Memorial is still there. People still visit the Jefferson Memorial. People still go to Monticello. Blah. Okay. He's still on the nickel. Monticello's still on the nickel, which is interesting. But of course, Jefferson, since the 1960s, Jefferson's reputation has endured a sustained attack, largely over slavery. Quite rightly. I mean, the Civil Rights Movement, one of the effects of the Civil Rights Movement had was to crack open American history. Up until that point, the history of slavery was not much talked about by American historians. They did everything they could to dance around the central issue of American history, which is odd. And they got paid for it. But nevertheless, you know, they didn't talk about slavery. Well, you could not talk about slavery after the 1960s, and so you could not talk about Thomas Jefferson in quite the same way. Although he criticized slavery through the 1780s, Jefferson certainly backed away from those criticisms. He never freed more than a handful of his own slaves, and the handful that he did free were members of the family of his concubine slave, Sally Hemings. In his notes on the state of Virginia, he attacked slavery mainly because he thought it was bad for white people, and he has some really hair-raising things to say about racial differences between blacks, between Africans and Europeans. Worse, his politics seem to be or cast now as a precursor to the southern small government pro-slavery politics that we associate with John C. Calhoun and Jefferson Davis. Right? There seems to be a direct line between the Virginia and Kentucky resolves that some of you may remember that you had a part in, with the nullification of John C. Calhoun, and indeed with the politics of George C. Wallace and the segregationists of the 1950s. Small government, stand up against the federal government when need be. People ascribe that to Jefferson, not completely wrongly. Jefferson's also faulted as a conniver, as a politician in the worst sense. Right? A man who preached harmony at his first inaugural address. Coming after a very bitter campaign in 1800, he talked about how, well, now we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists, we all have to join together, and yet who practiced, once in office, practiced very hardball politics. Who wrote, in fact, to his Attorney General, Levi Lincoln, 2 years after he was inaugurated, 2 years after he was elected, that we shall sink the Federalist Party into an abyss from which there shall be no resurrection for it. This is not harmony, and this is hardball politics. His assault on the courts, other things. He was also a man who preached limited government, yet, and a limited executive, yet who made the Louisiana Purchase, even though he thought it might be unconstitutional. And he's writing down, I don't know what I should do, this is a terrible idea, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. Less a man of principle, perhaps, than a man of the moment. Well, I want to say today that I understand why Jefferson has been criticized and why his reputation required a great reevaluation. But it's not so much that we've gone too far. I think that in doing that, we've obscured some of the things that remain important about Jefferson, particularly about Jefferson's place in the egalitarian tradition. First, on slavery. It's quite true that all the things that I just said about Jefferson are quite true, but still, he's begun to emerge as a caricature. How many of you well, you're all going to see Hamilton eventually, right? How many have actually seen Hamilton already? Okay, that's a number. I actually haven't, so I have to admit that I'm talking completely off my top here. But from what I gather, Jefferson does not necessarily come across so well in the play. Hamilton's the hero, especially on the issue of abolition. Okay. Well, I think that, and plays are plays and history is history, and I'm not going to be one of those really boring historians that goes, no, 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 no. That's fine, but I do want to make a case for, or to try and clarify a little bit where Jefferson actually stood on the issue of slavery. Because it's nowhere near the caricature that's begun to emerge. Remember that before the 1770s, there was very little in the way of anti-slavery politics anywhere in the world. Anywhere. For millennia, slavery had been considered a perfectly normal, indeed natural state of affairs. Go back and read your Aristotle. There were men born to be slaves and there were men born to be non-slaves. That was the way the world worked, and it worked that way. I mean, there was some of it at the end of the 17th century. The Quakers are doing things very deliberately here and there. But really, it took a sudden moral revolution in the 1760s and 1770s to change white people's minds about slavery. The slaves didn't have much problem about how bad slavery was. No, it's true. But there was a moral revolution that occurred in the 1770s, so that by the 1780s, for example, the first emancipation laws in world history are being passed actually in Pennsylvania and Connecticut and Rhode Island, places like that. The very first. They were limited, they were gradual, but nothing like it had ever happened before. The idea of a government abolishing a form of property, and we're a nation built on the idea of property, right? The sanctity of property. John Locke, all of that. Well, no, we're going to abolish an entire form of property because it's immoral. That takes a moral revolution. That was occurring in the 1770s. And Jefferson was a part of that moral revolution. He wasn't at the leading edge of it, but he was fairly close to it. In his 1774 Summary View of British America, in the draft that he wrote of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which the South Carolinians and the Georgians wouldn't let him get through, but which contained an eloquent, extraordinary denunciation of the slave trade, which had it appeared in 1776, would have been thought of as one of the great clarion calls of anti-slavery, early clarion calls to anti-slavery activity and thought in all of world history. In 1784, a committee that he was running in Congress came up with a bill that lost by a single vote that would have abolished all slavery in all of the territories of the United States. Which, when you think about, you guys from Illinois know, I mean, had that gotten through, American history would have looked very, very different. And that was Jefferson's doing. Later, it was to be included in the Northwest Ordinance, which Illinois, among other states, were to profit from, but nevertheless, he wanted to see all the territories left free. Now, saying this is not to say that his views remained consistent. Part of being a historian is to understand that people and things change, and he certainly changed. He certainly became much more circumspect, especially after those notes on the state of Virginia were published. He didn't think they would be published, and people got angry at him, and he thought that his position in Virginia politics might be undone. There's no doubt that his views on race were illiberal, even by 18th century standards, although here again he had an idea about the moral sense and the universality of the moral sense, which cut against the grain of his own racism, let alone those of other Americans. As slavery grew, and then with the Cotton Revolution, the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, and then the expansion of slavery thereafter, he still stuck with his old views, and he began to see anti-slavery as a federalist or neo-federalist plot. Still, it's a caricature, as I say, to see his legacy as somehow a precursor of the pro-slavery Confederacy, to see him as a kind of stalking horse, an early stalking horse for the likes of John C. Calhoun and Jefferson Davis. Indeed, in 1854, the year of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the year that the slavery issue was really beginning to cracked open American party politics, there were those in the Senate who rose to declare, or to pronounce, that the Declaration of Independence was a, quote, in the words of one senator, a self-evident lie. When the vice president of the Confederacy, of the new Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, tried to explain, or did explain, the cause of the Confederacy in 1861, he said that the Confederacy was based on a rejection of Jefferson's principle that all men are created equal. That, in fact, the Confederacy was going to be the first nation in the world based on the idea of white supremacy. This is not Thomas Jefferson. Likewise, I mean, on his inconsistencies as being a politician, well, as on the Louisiana Purchase, look, Jefferson never preached purity. He never preached what Emerson later called, that foolish consistency that is the hobgoblin of small minds. He saw the opportunities for the vast opportunities that the Louisiana Purchase provided. He had his doubts. He wanted to register those doubts, but he never had any question that he was going to push forward with it for very Jeffersonian reasons. As president, after the fierce election of 1800, I believe that rather than to see him as either inconsistent or craven or timid, that he provided a model of leadership that was protean, that was compromising, as he did on the bank, for example. I mean, he didn't like the Bank of the United States very much, but he knew it was going to have to stick, although he did get rid of the excise, as his enforcement of the embargo. To see all this as forms of inconsistency, I think, missed the point. They missed the point about what Jefferson was all about. So what was Jefferson really all about, I think? Well, one of them had to do with his idea of individual sovereignty. It is Jefferson who talks of, in the Declaration, the pursuit of happiness, who believed that all individuals, each of us, and he included here Africans, actually, in terms of their moral sense, all persons had the moral sense to pursue their happiness, and to undertake that pursuit would require political equality. They had to have the equal political access to actually go about doing so. He was not one who stood for liberty against equality or for equality against liberty, but who saw the two as deeply entwined. He also saw conflict as inevitable in society, at least in a democratic society, and a society, as he put it, had launched on, quote, the boisterous sea of liberty. And it was Jefferson, along with Madison, who actually formed the first political party in objection to the plans of, yes, the rock star Alexander Hamilton. It was the rock star Alexander Hamilton's ideas about how America should look that created the first Democratic Party in American history. And that was led by Thomas Jefferson. At first, to be sure, he saw the parties as temporary. He thought that Hamilton and his friends were so outside of the norm that they would be, put off to the side and then harmony would reign. Well, that turned out to be somewhat naive. But he did believe that the distinctions between, as he put it, Whig and Tory, or Republican and Federalist, were inevitable in any democratic society, that they would persist, and they became the parties. He also never gave up on his, or never spurned, and never gave up on his connection with some of the most egalitarian forces, not only in the United States, but in the Atlantic world. One of whom was the figure that I mentioned earlier as the kind of the originator of American egalitarianism, Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, when Thomas Paine's attack on Edmund Burke comes out, The Rights of Man, Jefferson hails it as the greatest thing that he's ever read. Things get a little bit quiet because Paine gets into trouble, but it is Jefferson who brings Paine back from France, from virtual exile, even as Jefferson himself is being called, all the terrible things that one could be called at that point, including infidel, blasphemer, etc. He's helping Thomas Paine. What a terrible thing. Jefferson says, fine, I'm bringing Paine back. And Paine became an advisor of his. In other ways, as I'll explain in a sec, he saw himself as a place where egalitarians, even the most reviled egalitarians, could actually have a place in government where they would go, where they could have something to say and be heard. Jefferson very much believed this. I mean, for Paine, there were only two real figures in American politics who came closest to his own ideas. One was Benjamin Franklin, his friend and sometimes patron, and the other was Thomas Jefferson. So here is where I'm going to read a little bit to give you a little sense, because I wrote this better than I can possibly say it now, about where I think Jefferson fits in with all of this. And it has to do with his place in the egalitarian tradition. And then if we have time, I'll try to read it quickly. We'll get on to Abraham Lincoln, who I know you really want to hear about. Okay. So, finally, Jefferson's abiding importance is in his contribution to democracy itself. Recent historians who have refused to grapple with the democracy and the Jeffersonian impulse, or who have rendered it clumsily and anachronistically as a populist cloak for white supremacy and slavery, have entirely missed what made Jefferson important in his own time and makes him important in ours. When Federalist polemicists and intriguers denounced Jefferson as a slaveholding hypocrite, it was not a battle cry for emancipation. It hardly could have been, given that so many of slavery's most extreme defenders were Federalists. What Federalists across sectional lines did agree upon was that Jefferson and his supporters' attacks on aristocracy, intolerance, and deference threatened to undo the natural order of things and to topple what the Massachusetts Federalist Fisher Ames called government by, quote, the wise and good and rich. The very word democracy gave Federalists shivers. Their aim, said the Federalist newspaper, the Portfolio of Philadelphia, was, quote, to present democracy in its native deformity. And I can go on about Alexander Hamilton in this a lot, but never mind. This is what made Jefferson so dangerous, and this is what drove the Federalists to distraction at the mere thought of a Jeffersonian America, as they envisaged guillotines at every crossroads, or as the Connecticut Federalist Theodore Dwight predicted, moral catastrophe. Quote, the ties of marriage destroyed, our wives and our daughters thrown into the stews, bordellos, a world full of ignorance, impurity, and guilt, without worship, without prayer, without a God. Jefferson and his party were steeped in Enlightenment liberalism. This too frightened the Federalists, who took Jefferson's devotion to science and his insistence on the complete separation of church and state as further proof of his depravity. And the American Enlightenment's devotion to science and rationality went hand in hand with the most democratic politics of the new nation. Although the Jeffersonians had strong bases in the South and West, to be sure, the crucial struggles for power occurred in the mid-Atlantic states, including the lower-class wards of New York and Philadelphia, where Jefferson supporters also embraced Thomas Paine and William Godwin, and denounced every kind of human slavery, and endorsed reforms ranging from public education to the abolition of imprisonment for debt. To these Jeffersonians, it was no surprise when Jefferson warmly invited Paine to return to the United States, a gesture of solidarity with the reviled infidel radical that Federalist newspapers swiftly denounced as proof positive that Thomas Jefferson was unfit for high office. Jefferson's appeal to these city Democrats was no ruse. A slaveholder in slaveholding Virginia, Jefferson, unlike the illiberal slaveholders who despised him and his vulgar infidel supporters, was attuned to the Democrats' egalitarian impulses, and he helped change forever the sum and substance of American life at many levels. In reforming the mercantilist political economy engineered by Hamilton, in which a favored, moneyed few would be the government's chief pillar, Jefferson opened the way for a more egalitarian commerce. But possibly his greatest contribution was to advance democratic political principles that we now take for granted. The Federalists believed, for example, that as soon as election days were over, the voting citizenry's participation was over, that they should therefore defer to their chosen representatives. Jefferson and his supporters, on the contrary, built the prototype for a modern political party with clubs and newspapers and political discussion and criticism year-round. Jeffersonians pushed at the state level, especially in the North, for widened access to the vote, including the reform or elimination of property qualifications, in the North as well as the South. In fact, mostly in the North. As a result of Jefferson's and his supporters' party-building efforts, the opening years of the 19th century brought some of the most intense campaigning and political and popular participation in all of American history. And I'll close with this on Jefferson. 10 days before he died, in the last letter he ever wrote, Jefferson contended that, quote, the general spread of the light of science had laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. Before Jefferson and his revolutionary generation, those saddles and those spurs were fully legitimate. They were legitimate no more, and they are legitimate no more, even if they have not all been fully destroyed. There is a paradox here, to be sure, and it goes right to the heart of the Jeffersonian dilemma. By his actions and inactions, and with his words on race, Jefferson created a paradox, the paradox, that stains and mars his memory. Living off human bondage and its unmetaphorical whips and chains, the legitimacy of which he denied and which mocked his declaration. And yet, over the centuries, more and more Americans have also ridden the ride of which Jefferson dreamed, more than Jefferson ever thought possible, by the grace of God, if you will, but also by the grace of Thomas Jefferson. So that's me on Tom. So I'm going to read you 2 sentences about Abraham Lincoln. That's about all I got left. All right, I'm going to summarize Lincoln very quickly. The whole point about Lincoln is either thought of as 2 things: either as an Olympian figure who was beyond reproach, or as a fake, the reluctant emancipator who really only went to war to save the Union, who had no interest in really ending slavery, who only ended slavery because he was pushed by runaway slaves and by Frederick Douglass to do so. Both of those are wrong. I won't go into the Olympian thing. We all know that no one can sustain that. But on the question of abolition, Abraham Lincoln was elected to the presidency on the proposition that slavery had to be destroyed. Now, he was not an immediatist abolitionist. He did not think it was constitutional to be able to go about doing such a thing, but he thought that slavery had to be put on the road, as he put it, on the course, rather, as he put it, of eventual extinction. That's why the South seceded. It didn't secede because they thought that Abraham Lincoln was soft on slavery. They seceded because they knew what he was about and what his party was about, the Republican Party, which nominated him in this great city. So when Lincoln came to the presidency, he was very clear about what he intended to do. And that's why the South seceded. Now, when the South did secede, he had bigger problems than just dealing with, territorial issues and figuring out a way to get rid of the Fugitive Slave Act. He was going to have to keep the country together, so of course he was going to have to keep the country together. But as you look through his relationship with the radical abolitionists in the book, which I hope you all have a chance to read, I concentrate on his connection to Frederick Douglass in particular, to show how the idea that Frederick Douglass somehow converted Abraham Lincoln is exactly backwards, that Abraham Lincoln did more to convert Frederick Douglass to his view of politics, really hits the mark. So I will quote one little bit, and it goes back to what I said at the very beginning about the character of egalitarianism and politics in American political history. Because Douglass, late in life, long after his friend, and they became friends, long after his friend Lincoln had been murdered, looked back on his friend. And it was Lincoln's pragmatic, at times cold-blooded, but always practical insistence on being a politician and understanding the limits of how far a politician could go to bring the country along that Douglass finally appreciated. They spent a very contentious time together. Douglass was always saying, Lincoln, you're not doing enough. Lincoln was always saying, calm down, Fred, we have to get this together. This is the way that Douglass put it in 1876. That enabled, in which Douglass remarked that Lincoln was able to restore the Union, quote, and free his country from the great crime of slavery. Quote, had he put the abolition of slavery before the salvation of the Union, he would have inevitably driven from him a powerful class of the American people and rendered resistance to rebellion impossible. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined, unquote. And I conclude that had Lincoln as president been the radical that many historians would have preferred that he was, let alone the abolitionists, the slaveholders would almost certainly have won the Civil War. So, I leave you then with my two keys of egalitarianism, but also of parties and politics, of seeing either converge, as in the case of Jefferson and Paine, and of Lincoln and Douglas, how great achievements in American history come from that convergence. Bringing moral justice to a society like any society that is by definition immoral and impure. In that battle, the politicians need the egalitarians, but the egalitarians no less need the politicians. Thank you. Thank you. So having cut into your time a little bit, I am happy to take questions.
Check, check. Folks, well, yep, you know
I'm
the
sorry,
drill.
how do you want to do this? Yes.
Yes, there have been historical periods when the political parties have been reshaped in one way or another, going back to the period after the 60s when the Republicans had a Southern strategy and the Northeast became much more heavily Democratic. Looking at historical insights, do you have any thoughts on where we are today in terms of a possible restructuring of the parties? Right. And particularly in terms of the convergence issue, where do you see us on the convergence scale today?
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Those are two questions, actually, two good ones. Yeah, I mean, look, coming out of the civil rights movement, which I say changed American history, it changed American parties. I mean, basically, the solid Democratic South became the solid Republican South, that is to say, the white South. And politics, I think, in many ways, since then, has been driven by that. Insofar as the Republican Party did, it had been the party of civil rights, became the party that stoked that base. It became the base of the Republican Party in large measure. It became more of a Southern party over time, by the time you get to Newt Gingrich and Tom DeLay and those people. Less an Illinois Republican Party, less a more traditional conservative Republican Party. So I think that what happened in the 60s is very much still alive in shaping what American politics has been. There was a reshaping then, but now we're seeing the fruits of all of that, I think. And we're seeing the fruits of all of that in the crisis that has hit both parties, I think, but has really hit the Republican Party very, very strongly. Because what happened was, I think, was that a party that had stoked that base watched that base revolt this year. That base finally said, you haven't given us anything you want, anything you've promised, we're angry, we don't want you. And that was the other 15 people on the stage, we want him. And the Republican Party has been in a state of convulsion ever since, trying to figure out what you do when the voters, the Republicans are no longer, the Republican voters are no longer in the Republican Party. So that's one question, is what's going to become the Republican Party after this election, no matter who wins the election. The Democrats also had their own crisis going back to the 60s, which was, played out here on the streets of Chicago in many ways. But it was the division between what was left of, once the Southern segregationists kind of left the party or being read out of the party eventually, then it was between an older kind of, Democratic, traditional, moderate, what do you want to call it, New Deal Democrats versus New Politics Democrats who were opposed to the war in Vietnam, who wanted to change the parties around. That was a split that was right there at the heart of the party between Kennedy and McCarthy on the one side and then Humphrey and Johnson on the other. It was expressed around the war, but it became deeper. And that division abided in the Democratic Party. And in some sense, it still abides. I mean, the Clinton years tried to soften it in some ways, tried to bring a party together, but didn't actually end up succeeding in doing that. So that the Democrats were left split. And I think that you saw some of that. Much has changed. I don't want to say that it's the same. You saw much of that in the primaries between Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton. a lot of that old stuff was still coming up, even expressed by a new generation. The one thing that holds the two of these crises in common together, apart from their origins in the 60s, was 2008, was the crash. But I think the crash then, which I think still is not fully expressed itself yet in party politics, really changed things around dramatically. People were hurt in ways they hadn't been hurt, were stunned by what had happened. There were long-term trends, but what happened there, I think, really did flick things. It didn't come up so much in the 2008 campaign, although at the very end, yes, I think, Senator Obama certainly profited by what had happened because the Republicans were in office. But it took a while for it to reach a boiling point, but boy, did it hit a boiling point this year, inside both parties. So what is the future of all of that? We'll know a lot better after Tuesday. I think the party that wins will be in better shape than the party that loses. But I think that is part of the stakes of what we're going for. I mean, this election is extraordinarily important for more reasons that I have time to list. I actually wrote a piece back long before, this is a year ago, saying this election was going to be enormous because no matter who the Democrat was, if that candidate won, then the Supreme Court would go in a different direction. And the Senate would probably go Democratic. It would look very, very differently. Whereas the Republican one, no matter who it was, the Republican Party have control of American government from the state houses all the way up to all three branches of the federal government. Those are two extraordinarily different outcomes. Now it's just, beyond. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to question a little bit your assertion about the morality of the issue in the 1760s and 70s. Because I think, and from what I can vaguely remember, it's not been recent, reading in John Adams's diaries and about the colonial conference, conventions, they were already in the issue of population and that issue of who do we count? Only those qualified to vote or all the people living in a particular area.
Right.
And they fluffed it off. They didn't, they couldn't get anti-slavery through in the 1776, but it was there and it was vital. Now, maybe you might say that they were covering it by saying it was such a moral issue, but I didn't think your statement really covered that enough.
Well, yeah, I mean, let me make sure I'm getting you, ma'am, that I'm reproducing exactly. What I'm thinking of is the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. Is that what you're referring to? Yes, okay. Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, especially this comes up as early as 1776, as you say, in the debate. It's all very quiet, but I mean, over whether the Declaration would include the anti-slavery stuff that Jefferson wanted to have in there, and they just turn it down, and that's a political reason. There's a real moral force behind what Jefferson's talking about. I mean, read if you read it, it's very moral, but it's being shut down because politically you cannot get all of these colonies to unite if you put that thing in. In 1787, around the Constitution, it's endlessly fascinating, and I'm writing a book about just this subject, about what was going on in Philadelphia in 1787, because the way it's usually been talked about is that politics triumphed over morality almost entirely. That at almost every step along the way, the Georgians and the South Carolinians, the most pro-slavery delegates, just basically beat the North and beat them politically. And that the North gave way because it had no choice. Well, that's true, but it turns out that there was a moral. There's some speeches that are given at the Constitutional Convention which aren't referred to enough, that are direct moral assaults on the institution of slavery, as well as on the slave trade. So it's there. And don't forget that by the time you get to 1787, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island have all abolished or started the process of emancipation. They've all, and if you read the Rhode Island Act in particular, it says human beings cannot be property. It is immoral to have such a thing. So morality is there. And in the end, in a very political way, and read my next book. I'm advertising for my next book. There are ways in which the North managed to do it, and they managed to do it essentially, I'll let it go, by refusing to acknowledge slaves as property in the constitutional wording. By doing that, it made Abraham Lincoln possible in ways that I can explain later on. But things were going on there where, you had to act politically, but there was a moral element too. I should say, for the Southerners, it was a moral issue too. They thought that slavery was a perfectly moral institution, that it was uplifting the Africans, and they thought it was a good idea. A view of morality that to us is, so exotic and weird and repugnant that we can't figure it out. But they really thought so. So they're arguing their own moral case, but they're doing so politically. I hope that clarifies a little bit what I was trying to get at. There's someone with the microphone. I'd be happy to call people.
We'll take the next question back here.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Although it was kind of parenthetical in your talk, you talked about the relationship between Frederick Douglass and Lincoln, and it made me think, although I think it might be from a movie and not maybe in reality, about the relationship as it was portrayed between King and Johnson.
Yes.
Is that an accurate kind of parallel, or not really?
I think that King and Johnson had a much stronger bond politically. I think that Douglas and Lincoln came to have a much stronger bond spiritually. I don't know which movie you saw. If you saw Selma, terrible. It's just wrong. I mean, most of the stuff in that wrong about but President Johnson, no. It has him basically attacking King, of conniving with J. Edgar Hoover to disgrace King and all the rest of it. That's all bunk. It just didn't happen. There's an excellent portrayal of the Johnson-King relationship in the play, later made into a television special called All the Way, which is about, now it only goes up to 64, it doesn't get into the Voting Rights Act in 65, but it shows how the two actually work things out. And there was a convergence that was spiritually, I mean, you can't imagine two people sort of very unlike each other than Lyndon Johnson and Dr. Martin Luther King. But politically, they understood each other, and they got a lot done together politically. Yes, J. Edgar Hoover was doing his thing. The FBI has been known to go rogue. It certainly did then. And so all those elements are in the story, but Johnson really wanted to get the Civil Rights Act done. He had to put off the Voting Rights Act for a year. King understood all of that. They were working in very close, not perfect harmony. They're tussling with each other, but they were on the same thing. Douglas and Douglas was always angry at Lincoln. Douglas was always saying, "Lincoln, you're such a sellout. Lincoln, you're terrible. Lincoln, you're awful." And then Lincoln would say, "All right, come to the White House and we'll talk about it." And every time Frederick Douglass came to the White House, he'd leave saying, "This is the greatest man in America. He really is anti-slavery." And then he'd go away for a while and he'd say, "Oh, that Lincoln, he's really a drag." And then, in 1864, Douglas is actually going again, hoping that they'll go for John C. Fremont, who would have been a disaster. But regardless of all that, and then he invites him to the White House, and once again, he becomes a great ally. And then finally, the third meeting, they only met 3 times. The third time is just after the second inaugural, and that's a very moving moment in all of world history, as far as I'm concerned, in which the two, they're spiritual, they got it, they meshed. And so I think that politically they were much more at odds than Johnson and King were, but in the end they understood, and it's really quite moving. And I hardly recommend any description of that meeting, particularly the one in my book. But no, there are wonderful descriptions of how those two came across. So that's how I would put it.
We'll take the last question on the right side of the house.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I do want to remind you that we have the book selling at Unabridged Bookstores right behind us, and the book signing will be downstairs.
And if you have any questions and you can get it to answer them, I'll hang around for a while too. At the book signing, we can talk. Yes, ma'am.
This talk is called The Gift of Partisan Politics.
Yes.
can you succinctly say what you believe the gift is? And do you believe that a third party is a gift?
Okay. The gift of partisan politics is it becomes the major vehicle for discontent, discontent is one of the things. For popular passion to have any expression in government at all, parties are the major vehicle for that, and they have been from the beginning of time. Now, politicians who understand how the system works, we're going to modify all of that. It's going to be debate. It's not going to be a direct expression. Direct democracy is not what we have, but we do have political parties who became the vehicles for that. Sometimes parties do their job, sometimes they don't. They are always coalitions, but that's a good thing because, you keep things from getting, the gyroscope from getting undone. So that you can, but generally you have a conservative party and generally have a liberal party, or they've been known to flip. So I think that from the very beginning, the gift of partisan politics is precisely that Americans, although they went against what the framers had intended, came up with a vehicle to organize a vastly expanding democratic electorate and find a vehicle for them to express themselves politically. Now, third parties are essential, have been essential, been very important to American politics. I mean, you can think of lots of third parties. The Republican Party was not a third party, really. The Know-Nothings were a third party. They were not a good party. But, the Progressive Party of TR in 1912, even though it was politically disastrous, introduces all sorts of interesting things that later come into being in the New Deal. But given the structure of American politics, and because we're a first-past-the-post system, third parties tend not to last. As the great historian once put it, third parties are a bit like bees. They sting and then they die. So they have a great impact, but to sustain the impact, eventually a third party is always going to be taking votes away from the party most like it. So people have a real problem with figuring out, well, wait a second, if we vote for the third party over time, we're necessarily going to elect the people we least like. And because the system works the way that it does, unless you change the Constitution, which could happen, but unless you change the Constitution, third parties are always going to have that limited but important function in American politics. But the idea of building a multi-party system, frankly, myself, do I want to see us more like Italy than we might already be about to become? No. I mean, I don't think a multi-party system work well precisely because parties, when they are functioning well, serve as coalitions to pull together a lot of different views and bring them out there. Whereas if you have a multi-party system, yikes. Yikes. Can you imagine? Well, proportional representation has its place, but I mean, I think that, to try to form a coalition, could you imagine trying to form a coalition out of imagine we have a multi-party system today. It might be 7 parties. Try to form a government out of those. Providential would have to be the result, I think. I like the idea, we should all be able to vote for someone we really believe in, right? But there may be only 30 other people in the country who want to be with us. And that's great, and we feel wonderful. Rah! But we're not a perfect society, so we have to deal with this society that's imperfect, and we want to try and actually make things better. So we often have to go with, it's not the lesser of two evils, and it's certainly not the evil of two lessers. What it is understanding that we are a very diverse country and that party politics has become the best way for us to get it done, even if we have to feel a little bit dissatisfied with the person we're backing. I think that's kind of mature. I mean, I've been married, right? It's never perfect, but it's okay. Anyway, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.